Hello everyone, welcome to the video. Today we are joined with Professor Leonard Lawlor. He is the head of the Department of Philosophy at Penn State University. He is the author of many books. Just to name a few, he's written From Violence to Speaking Out, The Challenge of Bergsonism, and Derrida and Husserl, The Basic Problem of Phenomenology. Professor Leonard Lawlor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Now, Henri Bergson is someone who I've kind of come across in a very indirect way. I actually first learned about him in a book called Philosophy of Religion, but he talks about a lot of different philosophers that kind of relate to the idea of the philosophy of religion, and one of them was actually Bergson. Before we talk about his ideas, what interested you, Professor, to study Henri Bergson?
Well, like a lot of Anglophone philosophers who work in French thought, when the English translation of Difference Repetition, Deleuze's Different Repetition in 1994, I ended up teaching a graduate seminar, I think in 96 or 97. And then I realized how important Bergson was for his own development. So I backtracked and started working on Bergson independently of Deleuze. And when I was doing that independent research on Bergson, I sort of fell in love with him, his ideas and everything. I found it very stimulating.
I would like, if possible, for you to kind of give us a rundown of Henri Bergson's ideas, just for me and the viewers also to learn.
I understand, duration is what he's really famous for, and the elan vital and creative evolution. For me, in my book, The Challenge of Bergsonism, this is following Deleuze. What's really important is the concept of multiplicity that Bergson develops in his first book. In English, it's called Time and Free Will. But the crucial thing about Bergson's concept of multiplicity is it combines continuity of time, but also heterogeneity of what appears. And that's very hard to think because you would think of this continuity as going to be sameness.
Yeah.
But actually, Bergson thinks this continuity with difference. And, Deleuze's most famous book is called Difference and Repetition for a reason, because he's inspired by Bergson. So continuity would be repetition, but difference through the repetitions. The example I use in my book, if I remember right, I've used it in other papers anyways. He talks about the experience of sympathy to another person who's in pain or, grieving or something. And he goes through this sort of going through the way we experience our sympathy from basically, wanting to run away from the person because we don't get involved with them, to the point where we're sympathizing with them in the usual sense of the word. We're feeling sorry for them. We want to help them. To the point where the other extreme is where you just want to give ourselves over to this person completely. And Bergson says this happens over time, but each phase, let's say, of the feeling sorry, the really sympathy part, or rejection part, feeling really sympathy for, and then really wanted to be with that person, really, really be with that person. He says they're all heterogeneous phases of the same continuity, the same emotion as it develops or evolves. So, and I take this kind of evidence pretty seriously. Again, you have a lot of the questions you sent me use the word reality a lot, and don't think that's a word that Bergson uses a lot, but I would need more time to look it up. But I can understand. I think how you're defining reality is objective reality. I put that adjective in front of it. But clearly, if we're talking about our phases of our emotional life, we would usually categorize it as subjective and not providing genuine evidence. But I do think that the evidence, well, Bergson says this, the evidence of our inner life, he says, is genuine evidence. It provides knowledge. So,
Because I'm taking a metaphysics class right now, and of course we're starting with Descartes, who was a huge skeptic, doubting everything, or at least in the first two meditations. Um, but you mentioned that um, we we can come to objective knowledge from our subjective experience. Um, does Henri Bergson kind of like lay out the arguments for that, or
again, it's an argument that a lot of people would not find very compelling. And but it's an interesting idea. In in the second half of Matter and Memory, he talked about matter in the last chapter. Really, is matter, and again, according to contemporary science in the 1890s, matter was generated by vibrations. I think that's still true today. That physicists think that as well, or the vibrations play a big role in the phenomenon of matter. So you realize that our interior life has different sort of speeds to it. And he thinks that we can slow it down or speed it up. He thinks we can go to the top, which would be God, which would be the most intense vibrations, the fastest, or go down the way to the. This is why I get confused. The fastest are matter, and the slowest are God. Actually, that's how it works. And but he thinks we can go up and down the scale, and therefore we have access to matter uh, and what you were calling objective reality. So, and that's why he says we can sympathize even with matter because of that. So, but the other thing he says in that introduction to English is called the creative mind. That's where introduction to metaphysics appears in English. The French title is La Pensée et le Mouvement. It's published in 1934. But in the introductions, he writes two introductions to that volume. And one of them, he says that as science becomes more and more sophisticated, it gets closer and closer to the reality of matter. So he's seeing science make progress in understanding the vibrations that generate at least the phenomenon of matter. And he thinks the more they move even towards mathematizing that, the closer they're getting to matter, to the reality of matter. But he thinks that our interior life has something at least analogous to that, and we can have, he would even say, direct access to what matter is by our ability to vary, so to speak, the speed of our inner experience. To be really intensity, make it more intense, less intense.
Mhm.
So again, I would imagine your viewers might be very skeptical of the argument I just gave, but
I wanted to kind of shift to a different topic that kind of relates to what I have been kind of learning recently, and that's the idea of um, Platonism and how Henri Bergson compares to the Platonic um, way of understanding metaphysics, I guess. Um, and I I read in your book on the challenge of Bergsonism that Henri Bergson twists free from Platonism, um, and I know that all of Platonism is pretty much to do with the, at least this metaphysics side. It's all to do with this theory of forms and all those things. So before we compare the Platonistic metaphysical views and Bergson's, do you have maybe a summary of the spirit of the age when it comes to like metaphysics at the two different times? Because I know they're so different by like they differ by like 2,000 years. So, what was the metaphysical worldview at Plato's time and also Henri Bergson's time? If you um, could say some about that.
well, I'm not a scholar in ancient Greek philosophy, but I certainly know a lot about it. But I mean, mathematics is just being founded as a science 2,600 years ago, and in Athens or in Greece, and Pythagoras is prior to Plato, and the
Yes.
Pythagorean theorem and Euclid is around Plato's time, if I remember correctly. So a lot of the philosophy in Plato and Aristotle is inspired by mathematics, but Plato especially because again prior 2,600 years ago, there's a philosopher called Parmenides
Yes.
who actually has many, well, he has a poem that survived where he talks about two ways, and one is the way of being, which never changes, and he has this idea of the one. And then the other way is the way of belief, which is not the one but the many. So there are lots of paradoxes that appear in ancient philosophy around the idea of the one and the many. So, but Platonism, and that's very important. Platonism is how Plato is appropriated throughout the Western tradition over the last 2,500 years, 2,400 years, up to the 20th century, basically. And that's always in terms of the two world theory and the theory of forms being up in the heavens. That's what That's what Socrates says in the Republic. They're up in the heavens and in Book 7. So, but that's what Platonism is. And of course, if you read Plato's dialogues, they're incredibly complex, very hard to understand.
Mhm.
Whatever is called Platonism has only a superficial relationship to Plato's philosophy. So,
Mhm.
so I mean, reading Plato in his own right, that's the important work to do as a philosopher. But if you want to understand the Western tradition of philosophy, then understanding, how he's been appropriated is very important as well. so, so Bergson, he never used the word Platonism as far as, but he does talk about the history of philosophy, and he does see himself as breaking with the history of Western philosophy. So he definitely reverses it because we're here with the idea of multiplicity. That's a synonym for the many,
Mhm.
and the one is a perfect identity or unity. And Bergson doesn't think that perfect identity or unity exists. So
Okay.
also, if there's a hierarchy between the one and the many in Platonism, right, then Bergson is going to reverse that to say the many is prior to the one. The one is a derivative from the many.
Do you see any, even if Bergson wasn't intending on it, do you see any overtones from Platonism that was, um, I don't know, maybe like creep into Bergson's philosophy at some point?
There's some there's something I've never been able to reconcile in my understanding of Bergson, and I mean there are many fantastic scholars, Bergson scholars in Paris. I mean I read their books all the time. I always think they're smarter than I am, but if you look at, if you take the concept of multiplicity seriously, which is in his first book, and it appears in the Introduction to Metaphysics as well. um, but then you look at creative evolution, which is 1907. So that's 11 years after the publication of Matter and Memory, and 18 years after the publication of Time and Free Will. His idea of evolution is a kind of unity to the vital force, vital impulse, Elan Vital, right? And then he says when it encounters matter, it actually fragments into multiplicities. So he says, like the species, the variety of species we have on animal species on the Earth, you know, evolved out of a sort of unified impulse. But then when it encountered the matter on Earth, the impulse, um, it encountered resistance. So it had to find the weakest places to go to deal with the matter, like a river trying to find a path. So it,
Yeah.
expanded in different kinds of streams. So you get, crustaceans, you get animals with feathers, you get animals with shells, shells, crustaceans or turtles, and animals with hooves rather than feathers, and humans, obviously. So, but it's hard to recognize. So that unified vital impulse being first, and then encountering that seems very Platonistic.
Hmm.
And then it hits matter and then diversifies itself. Produces varieties given the weaknesses in the matter it encounters.
Knowing how, um, I guess, different Bergson's philosophy was, especially being twisted free from Platonism, um, I think there is um, definitely ways in which his theories play a big role in um, evolution. And as you said, he of course was up to date with all of Darwinian's theories and all that. So I think,
There were other theories roaming around after Darwin. Many of them probably nobody studies anymore, but he knew them as well because they were popular in the end of the 19th century. So,
oh,
but anyway, so yeah, but he definitely knew Darwin. Definitely knew Darwin.
mhm.
Just one little point about intuition. I mean, it is later in Bergson's last book, now this collection of his writings in 1934, his last book in 1932, The Two Sources of Religion and Morality. He basically identifies intuition, what he was calling intuition in philosophy. He identifies it with mystical experience.
Mhm.
It's a very interesting shift. I mean, for me at least, I found this very compelling idea. But if you look at the very last page of Introduction to Metaphysics, you'll see there that Bergson says something to the effect that there is no intuition without study. So it isn't like you wake up one morning and have an intuition. You've got to, do all of your research in this area. And then Bergson then says then you might have an intuition. But even the religious side, the mysticism, famous mystics of the Christian tradition, were like nuns and priests, and they've
Yes.
been trained in Catholicism, so they knew the
Yes.
New Testament backwards and forwards, and they knew all the developments of the interpretation of the New Testament throughout Middle Ages and things like that. And so in a way, they're sort of like philosophers of religious experience. They've studied all the things written about religious experience, and therefore they have this mystical experience based on the study they've already done. Bergson doesn't say that in his 1932 book, but the
Hmm.
end of Introduction to Metaphysics gives you a clue about what he's seeing in the religious mystics in 1932.
Yes.
So,
This kind of reminds me of what he said in the Introduction to Metaphysics, where it's like metaphysics, or I guess there's two ways of saying it. There's science and there's also intuition, but both are in a way kind of dealing with truth. But you cannot have good science without good intuition. You cannot have good intuition without good science. So, um,
well, you would think great scientific discoveries like Einstein's quantum theory, he was, obviously incredibly intelligent, IQ wise, but he
yes,
studied all of physics and mathematics for decades before he came up with the quantum theory. Now, maybe Einstein never studied Einstein really, but he might not say he had an intuition, but Bergson would say, well, you don't know the study, all of a sudden things came together.
right,
He saw the facts, physical facts in a different way. And Bergson would say that was an intuition,
yeah,
so but anyways, I mean, so great scientific discoveries, you can think, there must have been something. I mean, we would say in everyday English or any, natural language, oh, he saw something, she saw something that I didn't see. And Bergson would say that's pretty close to an intuition, seeing something that others don't see. So, so it isn't, if you add in the requirement of research and study, intuition doesn't look like, it doesn't look as, you shouldn't be so skeptical about it. So,
right,
because it does sound just like introspection. The first 5 pages of Introduction to Metaphysics, he says we sympathize with ourselves most of all.
right,
And that's clearly an introspection comment. But then by the end, he's actually saying, but look, do you have that moment of introspection and intuition? You don't just do it willy nilly. You've got to do all this setting the stage for it. And it might not come. He doesn't, it might not come, the intuition. We have lots of scientists and philosophers who are just journeymen in their disciplines, and they do the daily work for the geniuses, and so
right,
and Bergson's big example all the time is art and literature. He's a great admirer of Shakespeare, actually. So, but he thinks there's really intuition for creative activity, creative production, creative, art. Well, and Bergson basically says you can't do philosophy without knowledge of science in the normal sense, physical science, physics, or something like that. And but he also said you can't do philosophy without knowing about art as well. Uh,
interesting.
so again, I'm a journeyman in philosophy because I don't know much about natural sciences. But I do know quite a bit of art, but again, I don't know much about natural sciences. I mean, again, it's outside of popular knowledge, So
Hmm. That kind of reminds me of Plato saying that if we want to have true good philosophers, you have to start with like showing them what good art is. But yeah, that's just something that I
the other thing
thought
you
about.
mentioned symbols or signs and intuition. There is a middle space between the two, which are images. So when I teach Bergson at any level, undergraduate or graduate, I always tell students that you got to look at the images really carefully because I think this is an introduction to metaphysics. The images can lead you to an intuition. That's what he says.
Right.
I think it is an introduction to metaphysics. So, so the images are really important. But again, so they're something different from symbols, but they are not quite an intuition. So,
Okay. Interesting.
So that's why the color spectrum, which you have in your YouTube video,
Yes.
is an image that he uses, but it's an image. But it's supposed to help
Right.
us understand what duration is and this ability to move up and down in terms of the speed of vibrations between spirit and matter, to move up and down between these two. So, and
Interesting.
even for multiplicity, this color spectrum, we conceive it as continuous, but we can all tell the difference between green and red, or even
Right.
shades of green and shades of red. We can tell the
Right.
difference. So it is a kind of continuity with heterogeneity in it. So
I mentioned about Platonism, but I also um, wanted to ask if you have any insights on Bergson and Aristotle because, of course, I started with Aquinas, who was really influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle, his metaphysics has a lot to do with teleology, and that's kind of what Aristotle uses in order to prove, or that's what Aquinas uses to pretty much prove God. Um, but Bergson kind of has this theory where it's in a way against the idea of teleology, where um, the future is not, of course, determined and would you say random? Is it-
no, I mean, he doesn't have a causal explanation for what happens.
Right.
So I don't know whether random. I think you mentioned chance in your questions you sent to me, which that that just really puzzled me. I don't think Bergson ever talks about chance.
Okay.
But clearly he's anti-teleological because he thinks novelty's happening all the time. I mean, there's novelty in lowercase n, there's novelty in uppercase. Uppercase is creative activity like painting and writing novels or writing plays or
Right.
something.
Right.
But novelty with a lowercase is the fact that our experiences are just constantly changing. And if we pay attention to them more, we ever understand that every moment is novel. I mean, we would never say that, but we would say different maybe.
Yeah.
So there's no novelty if there's teleology, at least the way Bergson understands teleology, because he understands have a pre-design. You have some sort of design, maybe vague design, which then you try to achieve. But the even if it's vague, it doesn't allow you to have novelty because you're just
Hmm.
filling in the gaps in the design. So I'd say in the preface to my book, Challenge of Bergsonism, say the slogan for this book could be "The whole is not given."
Hmm.
And that means that there's nothing complete at the beginning, which is only being actualized, let's say in matter. It's
Hmm.
like an image, an idea in God's head is actualized on through his creation on earth. But it was a full idea in God's head, right? God's mind, or whatever. So
You mentioned about how he would say that I think he said that it was God is the vital impulse. Um, I also know that Henri Bergson, I think it was like I don't know if it was the end of his life, but he decided to take a very how should I say strong theistic approach, or at least started having that belief. And I think it was because of the ideas that he came up with. Me not having read Bergson a lot, I cannot see how his ideas led to uh, theistic understanding of reality. But um, is that what creative evolution makes more clear as to why he did um, kind of start believing
so
more?
yeah, that would be textual evidence for it. I mean, if you go read his letters and other small texts he wrote in the 1890s, early 1900s, there's quite a bit. I mean, on mysticism already. He's
Okay.
already very interested in mysticism. It only appears in print in 1932. And so he always had a kind of religious outlook, I think, from the beginning of his writings.
Okay.
But again, the two sources of morality and religion, chapter 3 is where he talks about God. But again, it's a God concept of God that most Christians would not agree with.
Okay.
So I
Okay.
mean, he says that God is a loving God, but he also has this argument that God actually needs us,
Hmm.
which
Okay.
goes against the idea that God's omnipotent. If God needs
Right.
us, that means he, she, them is not omnipotent. And that goes against almost all Christian doctrines and even Jewish doctrines, I would think, Judaism doctrines as well. So, so it's a very, doctoral dissertation could be written on the concept of God in Bergson. There's that much material to go through and try to tell a story about it. But it wouldn't be a God that we'd be surprised, I think, by the concept of God that we developed in some sort of study of Bergson.
If we could shift it also, once again, I know that phenomenology is a huge topic of study. Um, Probably starting with, well, I guess depending on which kind of phenomenology, some would say it's Husserl, but also a lot of people will talk about even earlier ones. But I guess it would be very helpful for me if you can kind of give us a kind of summary of what phenomenology is, and then potentially after how Bergson's ideas were similar or dissimilar to the ideas of phenomenology.
Yeah, I think I can do that. Just the word phenomenology is coined by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. That's where the word comes out of. And that's where Hegel gets it from, but also where Husserl gets the word from as well. Kant doesn't develop it very far in the critique, in the first critique, but yeah, I mean, there's certain similarities with Bergson and Husserl in terms of trying to describe experiences in a neutral way without presuppositions. So you might say, I had this experience, then immediately say, well, it was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was 10 feet away from, something. And we start to mathematize it almost by habit.
Yes.
But both of them tried to remove the mathematization from the experience, to describe the experience as such, without that mediation of mathematics or customs or things like that. So, but unlike Bergson, I mean, Husserl develops a whole method, a very complicated method to gain access to what he calls phenomena, which is our experiences, but he uses that technical word. So, which is Greek, it's a Greek word. So, um, and the methodology is quite, like, he's changing it throughout his career as well, but it's still it seems very laborious, and so, and Bergson doesn't really ever develop a method, like a whole, like,
Right.
book on method. So that's somewhat of a difference between them, but both of them, again, similarity is that they're both trying to overcome the subject-object distinction, which I mentioned earlier in our meeting, and because of the problems that come up out of Cartesianism, where the cogito, we don't know how the cogito actually meets up with extension with matter, basically. Descartes has no story except for this crazy story about the pineal gland in your brain. He thinks that's where the cogito and matter meet up is in our brain somewhere, but it's a pretty strange story. Um, but anyways, but they've sort of Husserl and Bergson have sort of similar ideas of going back to consciousness and starting from there. So Husserl's methodology is all attempt to get to a pure level of consciousness, without any of the habits, without your proper name, without your image of your body, so that's why the method is so complicated. So he wants to try to get to consciousness without all those things that we normally think are maybe essential for consciousness. He tries to push them out to show how consciousness itself can generate all these things and knowledge about them. So, and Bergson going to duration is a similar move. Um, but the thing that's really different is that Husserl has no concept of the unconscious. And even though he's read Freud in the 1920s, he never writes about the unconscious. But Bergson, in 1896, in Matter and Memory, already has a concept of the unconscious around the same time that Freud's developing his. Freud's first book is published in 1896, 1897. So they're working in tandem, Bergson and Freud. Of course, Freud has a much more vigorous idea of the unconscious than Bergson does, but the unconscious is part of his explanation of memory, because right now you're paying attention to me, right?
Yes.
So your memorial life is unconscious, right? You're not paying
Yep.
attention to it. It's not conscious. So it's a pretty slim. Well, I could go make it fatter, but it's a pretty slim story about the unconscious compared to Freud's story about the unconscious. With all the drives and things like that, and repression. And the role of dreams in Freud. So, but that's very different from Husserl. Husserl, there are some fragments he wrote about the unconscious in the 1930s, but nothing that gives you a clue about it playing any role in his philosophy. So,
Is phenomenology also um would Husserl also agree that in order to have this pure consciousness, then we would have to, in some way, have to rely on what we've learned through like science or
well, he says you would bracket all, especially when he says any existential um, comment about things, you'd have to put that out of play. He used the word bracket
oh, okay. Yeah.
to bracket, put it on the outside. And then, so he really wants to eliminate the idea that what I have contact with is real, because he wants to show how reality is generated from consciousness. So
Hmm.
then he's a conscious component to generate it. So, but yeah, he also talks about in one of his main books, Ideas One, published in 1913. He says a number of things have to be put out of play, like theism. He says we can't talk about God. We're not going to talk about God in order to get access to pure consciousness or pure phenomenon. But he also says mathematics, which would include all the natural sciences. So you have to go back to the stage just prior to all of those things. He thinks, Husserl thinks the mathematization of nature is a betrayal of nature. The nature itself is not mathematizable. Bergson thinks it is actually, but not Husserl. So the unconscious is a really big difference between the two. Um, but the similarity, another similarity is seeing time as fundamental in all experience, and um, and obviously being in time by Heidegger puts time in a foundational, gives a foundational role. So that brings all three of them together in a way that's very interesting, very important for the history of 20th century philosophy.
Got it. Got it. As we're wrapping up the conversation, I know you've spent a lot of time studying Bergson. I want to get your opinion on like, I guess, um, what is Bergson's impact in today's world, and where do you see it going in the future?
I don't really know the answer. I mean, I would think that Bergson, well, he's been revived. His interest has been revived in him. It's more in a scholarly way rather than for philosophical innovation. It's
Okay.
different with Derrida and Deleuze. Derrida never mentions Bergson, but Deleuze obviously mentions him all the time. And but Bergson's philosophy has been, Deleuze's philosophy has been taken up all over the planet. Believe it or not, there's like a really active Deleuze society in India. You know, and there are Deleuze societies in South America. I mean, it's like crazy. There's like Deleuze conferences like every week somewhere on the planet. It's really crazy. So indirectly, if Deleuze's philosophy is having an impact on how a lot of people are thinking, then Bergson's having an indirect impact on that. Because Deleuze would readily say, I'm a Bergsonian. So, but I think, I'm in France often enough, and I know all these Bergson scholars, but they're really interested in the scholar of Bergsonism or Bergson. And, they're looking for little fragments that we never seen before. And
Hmm.
his deathbed wishes was his wife would burn all the manuscripts that he had in his study that he was writing, and she did. So we don't know.
Wow.
So there's a very small amount in the archives. But these courses he gave at the Collège de France, and then actually there's notes from courses in the 19th century. He started lecturing as a graduate student, like in 1888 or something, before the publication of his doctoral thesis. Um, and those have been preserved too. So all the scholars are like going to these courses and saying, "Oh, what can you find out about Bergson?" and that would illuminate the books and something we could say new about Bergson and but I don't think there's a real interest in Bergson as an inspiration anymore. I don't
Okay.
see that coming back. I don't know. Again, I can't predict the future. You know,
Right.
there's
Right.
still Descartes people roaming around,
There.
espousing his philosophy and saying it's something we have to take seriously and we can move forward through Descartes. It's there's Platonists still around who think Plato has to be extended in new ways, and so maybe Bergsonians will come around and start to innovate based on his thinking. But right now, it looks like a scholarly endeavor primarily. So.
Got it.